Okay, welcome to parts 2 through 4, which contain the argument for the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. If you have not watched part 1, I would recommend watching that, as it contains important background information to understand parts 2 through 5. This argument is broken into 7 steps. Why 7? Because if we look at our timeline of events, there are 7 points at which there might be an error in the gospel accounts. The first of these is in the ministry of Jesus. Some would say that Jesus never existed, which would make the gospel accounts false. The second point is the roughly 30-year gap between Jesus' ministry and the time when the gospel accounts were written. It must be shown that the original accounts contain the events of Jesus' ministry. The third step takes place at the time when the gospel accounts were written. It will be shown that they were written independently of each other and that they did not use an outside source to make their accounts. The fourth point also takes place when the Gospels are written, and is that the Gospel accounts were not concerningly biased, meaning biased to a degree that we should be concerned about the basic truthfulness of the events contained therein. The fifth step spans the roughly 100-year gap between Jesus' ministry and the date of the first extant manuscripts. It must be shown that the events of his ministry were accurately transmitted to the first manuscripts. The sixth step is that the events of the earliest extant manuscripts were accurately transmitted through time. Some might say that they were copied too many times to do this. The seventh and last step is that the final gospel accounts in 1440 AD, the ones we have today, do not contradict in a large enough way to question their basic reliability. In part 2, I will defend steps 1 through 2. We will start with step number 1, which is that Jesus existed as a historical figure. There are 5 lines of evidence for this. The first comes from the astonishing number of manuscripts of the New Testament, which is about 24,000. Now, just because a bunch of people wrote it down doesn't mean it is true. However, if Jesus did not exist, these people, some of whom lived within 2 centuries of Jesus' ministry, would be completely deceived, thinking Jesus existed when he didn't. Regardless of the other things they wrote, the likelihood of this is low. The Christian church would be the greatest hoax in human history up to this point. One would also have to say that all the church fathers were deceived too. That seems pretty unlikely. The second line of evidence comes from early Christian testimony. This includes the church fathers, who quote the New Testament so extensively that about 95% of it could be reconstructed just from their quotations of it. And there are the early Christian creeds, such as the Nicene Creed, which do the same thing. The third line of evidence is the existence of the Christian church. If Jesus didn't exist, then where did the Christian church come from? Without Jesus, the church would be the greatest hoax of all time. Do we really think that billions of people, including the early martyrs that died for their faith, have been deceived into thinking that Jesus existed when he didn't? We wouldn't apply nearly that degree of skepticism to other movements. If one objects to this because I am using Christian sources, such as the writers of the New Testament manuscripts, the church fathers, or the Christian church as a whole, saying that there is a conflict of interest, I would say that bias does not equal falsehood. I scarcely know of a conclusion where the person making it did not want their conclusion to be true, but we do not cast them out like the skeptic would cast out the testimony of Christians. Besides, the fourth and fifth lines of evidence are from more secular sources. The fourth line of evidence is that the main events of the Gospels are also recorded by outside sources. From these, we know that he was called Christos in Greek, which means Messiah in Hebrew. They mention that he had a brother named James, that he convinced both Jews and Greeks that he was God, that the Jewish leaders didn't like him, and that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. And these were taken from an article by Sean McDowell, a Christian apologist, although when I looked for it afterwards in order to cite it, I could not find it, so I am citing it verbally. But Jesus' existence was not denied even by those who hated him. If anyone would have a reason to deny Jesus' existence, it would be them, so the fact that they didn't is strong evidence that he existed. Looking at specifically the claim that Jesus died by crucifixion, this is mentioned directly by the Jewish historian Josephus. Tacitus, the Roman historian, also mentions it, and he was not a Christian. Lucian, the Syrian satirist, said that the Christians worship a man who founded their rites and was crucified, referring to Jesus. Mara bar Serapion was an imprisoned philosopher who wrote a letter to his son sometime in the 1st to 3rd century, saying, "What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished." The abolishing of their kingdom likely refers to the Romans sacking Jerusalem in AD 70, and he says there is a king of theirs that was executed just before this. The most reasonable candidate for this is Jesus. Then there is the Talmud, which is a compilation of Jewish law and tradition compiled from the 3rd to 6th centuries AD. It says that on the eve of Passover that Yeshu, meaning Jesus, was hanged, which means crucifixion. And the Talmud is not overly fond of Christianity. So one does not have to be a Christian to accept the major events of Jesus' life, including his crucifixion, let alone the fact that he existed. For this reason, the vast majority of New Testament scholars accept the existence of Jesus as historically likely. This includes even the non-Christian scholars. Saying that Jesus didn't exist is not an argument that is found often in scholarly circles. So I cite scholarly consensus as the 5th line of evidence for Jesus' existence. So here we have our first step filled out, which is that Jesus existed. Step 2 is that the events in Jesus' ministry were accurately transmitted to the time when the gospel accounts were written, which is about a 30-year gap. One might say, well, isn't this relying on the author's memory, which is scientifically known to be faulty? I have trouble remembering what I ate for dinner yesterday, if it was spaghetti or bean soup, let it alone something that happened 30 years ago. We will answer this in 2 phases, showing that the accuracy of the original accounts is firstly plausible and secondly likely. The accuracy is plausible because the Jewish culture at the time highly valued memory. They didn't have the internet to download things on, and most people were illiterate. So their main form of communication was verbal, conveying events through oral tradition. As a result, it is likely that their ability to remember things was much greater than our own, to the point that 30 years would not be too distant. Secondly, what happens to the authors or the Gospels was to them a life-changing event, which makes it more likely that they would remember it. To compare, it would be like asking a Desert Storm veteran today about their experiences. We would generally trust their account because of how traumatic it was. The ministry of Jesus had a similar effect on those who wrote the Gospels, but in a good way. Thirdly, it is highly unlikely that the authors waited for 30 years before they wrote anything down. It is likely that there were precursors to the final versions of the Gospels, such as notes or rough drafts, and it seems that like they would have kept these for when they put their final version together. So the gap probably wasn't 30 years, although this is more so speculative. Fourthly, the gospel writers likely were surrounded by other Christians, if not by each other, and would have been constantly exposed to the teachings of Jesus as they were passed down. So it's not like they met Jesus, then sat around twiddling their thumbs for 30 years, and only then decided to write the Gospels. Now these options are somewhat speculative and should therefore be treated as only plausible. Luckily, though, their accuracy is not only plausible, but it is also likely. We have non-biblical sources mentioned earlier that corroborate the main events of the gospel accounts. This confirms at least the basics of their story. Also, 30 years is a short enough time that other eyewitnesses would have still been alive. If the authors were unsure of something, all they had to do was ask them. It is unlikely that the testimony of several eyewitnesses would err in the same way. These eyewitnesses included both friend and foe, so if there was anything majorly false, the enemies of the Gospels would be quick to point it out publicly. Thirdly, the Gospel writers who were Jewish would have placed a high value on truth, and especially on God's Word. We can see this by reading the Old Testament that formed the basis of their conduct. Exodus 20, verse 16 says, to not bear false witness. Proverbs 12:22 says that lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. If the gospel writers were true Jews, then they would have been wary of writing something that they were unsure of. Proverbs 30, verse 6 says, don't add to God's words, lest he prove you a liar. and the gospel writers believed that Jesus was God, which means that they were not likely to add to his words or take away from them for that matter. Any doubt as to his words would have been carefully investigated. Furthermore, Deuteronomy 18:20-22 gives the test of a false prophet, saying that the prophet whose prophecy doesn't come true should be killed. Since the gospel writers were not just claiming to have one or two prophecies, but the very actions and words of God for the 3.5 years of his earthly ministry, they would have been guilty of far worse than false prophecy if they were wrong. And they were most certainly aware of this, which is why I think they were extra careful. And we see that the transmission methods for the Old Testament were quite rigorous, pointing to the seriousness with which they viewed God's Word. It wasn't some Joe Schmo copying Exodus in his mud hut. Scribes were highly trained, and they took their job seriously. They were well-educated, well-read, and could not interrupt their work even for prayer. They employed correctors to check for errors, among other rules. This shows that the Jews highly valued accurate transmission of God's words. So to say that these same people made up, embellished, or were honestly mistaken about the words of one who they thought to be God is really far-fetched. And the last and most important piece of evidence that the gospel accounts are accurate is the fact that they don't contradict. The 4 gospel accounts are different enough that we know they are independent, yet similar enough that they record many of the same events. If the accounts were error-filled, then the chance that at least one would contradict the other is extremely high. For example, all 4 accounts record the resurrection of Christ. If Mark had a lapse in memory and accidentally wrote down that it happened on Wednesday, then it would disagree with the other accounts that say it happened on Sunday. Note that this would not be possible if there was only one account or if there were 4 accounts that were derived from a common source. To emphasize this, I will combine the testimony of the 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' death to show how they are both independent and closely interwoven. The logic is that if the gospel accounts were honestly mistaken, which would include having memory lapses, they would not agree on minute details. This works in 2 ways. Firstly, the details that are reported in multiple gospel accounts are unlikely to be false, for it is unlikely that multiple eyewitnesses would randomly err in the same way. For example, if we had 4 eyewitnesses in a courtroom and they all agreed that the suspect of a robbery was a large man, we would take the fact that all 4 of them say this as evidence that the suspect actually was a large man. But let's say there are other details of the robbery that are not reported by all 4 of them. For example, only one eyewitness reports that the suspect was in the building for about 10 minutes, and another eyewitness uniquely reports that the police did not immediately apprehend the suspect. These reports agree, for it is consistent that if the suspect was at large for 10 minutes, that the police did not immediately respond. One could say that if either one of them was mistaken, that they would have included details that contradict the other. For example, if the first eyewitness said that the suspect was only at large for 1 minute, then that would contradict what the other eyewitness said about the police not apprehending him immediately. So, the fact that they provide separate details that are consistent is further evidence for their truthfulness, for it is unlikely that they would err in a way that is consistent with each other. So, we would say that consistent testimony is evidence of its truthfulness, both through the details that they all report and through the details that are unique and yet do not contradict. For the chance that random error would produce a contradiction is high. For this reason, the consistent nature of the 4 gospel accounts on the unique details is compared to a ball of yarn, composed of red, yellow, green, and blue yarn. These 4 colors represent the 4 gospel accounts. If one is out of place, one would expect it to be out of alignment with the others, since they are interwoven so tightly. Likewise, the gospel accounts are tightly interwoven, such that even a minute error in one of them would place it out of alignment with the others. Note that this only rules out the possibility of unintentional, random error, such as lapses in memory. It does not completely rule out the possibility of intentional error, such as collusion, bias, or fraud, which are addressed later, although I do think it makes intentional error unlikely the main focus of this part is on unintentional error. But let me give a few simpler examples before we dive into the account of Jesus' death. Matthew's account says that there was one angel at the tomb, and John's account says that there were two angels. Is this a contradiction? No, for if Bill and Bob go shopping, and I say later that Bob went shopping, that is true even though I don't mention Bill. For where there are two, there is always one. It works every time. Likewise, Matthew's account of one angel is true even though he doesn't mention the other angel that is mentioned in John. So, the fact that Matthew and John's accounts are different shows that they are independent. The fact that they are reconcilable shows that they are tightly interwoven like the ball of yarn, leaving little room for error. Or, Matthew says that the centurion asked Jesus if he could heal his son. Luke says that two elders were sent to Jesus on behalf of the centurion to ask him. So which is it? Well, it is possible that Matthew was giving an abbreviated account and simply did not choose to include that the centurion technically asked Jesus through his representatives. So the centurion did ask Jesus, as Matthew says he did, and Luke adds that how he asked was through two elders. The fact that they appear to contradict is strong evidence that they are independent and not derived from the same source. And like the ball of yarn, the fact that this apparent contradiction is reconcilable shows that they are closely interwoven, leaving little room for honest mistakes. Let's give one more example. In Matthew 14, Matthew records that Herod was afraid of the people and was therefore reluctant to execute John the Baptist. But one might ask, how does Matthew, an ex-tax collector who was following Jesus around at this time, know Herod's emotional state? So on the surface, Matthew appears to be speculating about Herod's emotions. But Luke comes along in chapter 8 of his book and adds that Joanna, wife of Chuza, who was in King Herod's court, supported Jesus' ministry. So it is plausible that she was the source of Matthew's information. The fact that Matthew and Luke's account focus on such different details is evidence that they are independent. And the fact that these differences are reconcilable is evidence that they are not honestly mistaken. So now that we understand the concept, let's dive into the four gospel accounts of Jesus' death. This is the climax of the entire Bible. This is where the price was paid, making it only a matter of time before God would destroy evil once and for all. So I thought it fitting to analyze this event. To do this, I started with Matthew's account, given in Matthew 27:45 through 54. This is color-coded in red. I then read Mark's account in Mark 15:33 through 39, and added any details to Matthew's account that were not contained there. Mark is color-coded in yellow. I then added any details from Luke's account in Luke 23:44 through 47 that were not contained in either Matthew or Mark's account. Details from Luke are color-coded in green. Likewise, I added any details from John's account in John 19:28 through 30 that were not stated in Matthew, Mark, or Luke's account. Details from John are color-coded in blue. I also inserted a word or two here and there to make it flow. Details from me are color-coded in black. I try not to repeat myself. For example, there would be no point in stating that there was darkness from the 6th hour to the 9th hour 3 times, one from Matthew, one from Mark, and one from Luke. But if there was a difference in the accounts, then I included such details, even the parts that were difficult to reconcile. I will point these parts out as I go. I try to be open about any potential issues. Lastly, I do not expect the account I compiled to be 100% accurate. I think it is reasonably close, but I did make some judgment calls. Even with this, my point will be shown quite powerfully. At this point, I recommend that you pause the video and read the combined account before I explain it, so as to familiarize yourself with the account and with the key. Starting with Matthew's account in verse 45, it says, "Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour." This detail is repeated in Mark and Luke, so I did not include those verses. However, Luke 23:45 does add that while this darkness happened, that the sun's light failed. So it was some kind of solar event, not a dust storm or something. At this point, and this is where one of the judgment calls were made, John 19:28 says, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. So sometime around the 9th hour, Jesus said, I thirst. Also around the 9th hour happens the events that are contained in Matthew's account. This says, and about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, this man is calling Elijah. And one of them at once ran and took a sponge and filled it with sour wine. And I will stop there because John 19:29 adds that there was a jar full of sour wine that stood there, which is where the person got it from. Going back to Matthew, he put it on a reed, and from John's account, we know that this reed was a hyssop branch. In Matthew, is Matthew, by saying it was a reed, contradicting John, who says it was a hyssop branch? No, for it is possible that reeds are a general class of plants in which a hyssop branch could belong. In any case, a minor contradiction would not justify rejecting the entire narrative. Moving on, Matthew says that he gave this wine-soaked sponge on the hyssop branch to Jesus to drink. John says that the man held it to his mouth, and Mark adds that this person was simultaneously saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Elijah refers to the Messiah's forerunner prophesied about in the Old Testament. These people were mocking him, saying, he claims to be the Messiah. Let's see if his forerunner will rescue him. And you can see at this point why I chose to include John 19:28, which records Jesus saying, I thirst, before Matthew 27:46. Because once we hit 46 in Matthew's account, we really can't stop until the end of verse 48, which of course is after Jesus receives the wine. It would make no sense for him to say, I thirst, when he had already received the wine, unless it was his point to say that what they gave him wasn't nourishing. But John's account clears up any doubt when it says that the reason he said, I thirst, was to fulfill the prophecy that says this would happen. This refers to Psalm 69:21, which says, for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink. If Jesus' point in saying, I thirst, was to fulfill this prophecy, then that indicates that the giving of sour wine hadn't happened yet, which is why I placed it before Matthew 27:46 through 48. With that being said, that was one of my judgment calls that may impact the accuracy of what I compiled. So it appears that there are two reasons for why Jesus was offered sour wine. According to John 19:28, it was Jesus saying he was thirsty. According to Matthew 27:46, it was Jesus crying out from Psalm 22. These do not contradict. Both reasons were present. Then Matthew says in 27:49, but the others said, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. So the person that gave Jesus the wine was saying this, according to Mark 15:36. According to Matthew, others were saying it too. Again, these do not contradict. Matthew and Mark are simply recording the same event from different perspectives. Matthew chose to emphasize the others, and Mark chose to emphasize the person carrying the reed. Both the man and the others were saying it. However, I do not know why Matthew says in verse 49, but the others said, indicating that there was some kind of disagreement between the one who offered it and the others. Perhaps the others didn't say it at first, but did shortly afterwards. That seems ad hoc, though, so this is one of the differences that I could not resolve. Regardless, after Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, according to John, it is finished. This was a legal term indicating the final payment of a debt. Only John records this, and he is saying that Jesus knew that he was about to give his life, which of course would pay the price for our sin. After this, Luke records in 23:45 that the temple curtain was torn in two. So Jesus got the sour wine, he said, it is finished, and the temple curtain was torn in two, indicating that the way to God had been forged. And this, that it had been paved, I should say. And this was perhaps the last thing that Jesus saw before he died, a visible sign of his spiritual success. Because the account picks up again in Matthew, who says in 27:50, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice. What did he cry out? Luke answers us, saying it was, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," according to Luke 23:46. This is likely a quote from Psalm 31:5. Now some think that Jesus crying out in Matthew contradicts the fact that he said in Luke, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." But it seems more reasonable to say that what he said in Luke is what he cried out in Matthew, or possibly that he cried out and said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," on separate occasions. So this is not necessarily a contradiction. Moving on, John 19:30 adds that Jesus bowed his head, and Matthew 27:50 says that he yielded up his spirit, and Mark 15:37 says that he breathed his last. And it makes sense to put the bowing of Jesus' head from John after he cries out, since it will be difficult to cry out when one's head is bowed. And it makes sense to save Mark's account until last, since Jesus could not have done anything if he had already breathed his last. Again, there are no contradictions here. These accounts are meticulously interwoven. Now, many skeptics and even some Christians seem to assume that any difference between the gospel accounts is a contradiction. But I think that the differences point all the more to their truthfulness, just as the 4 complementing eyewitness testimonies in court would establish their testimony. In any case, it shows that they are independent, meaning the parts that are not different are all the more reliable. Besides, assuming that a difference is a contradiction is not the standard that is used on other documents. Generally, the authors are given the benefit of the doubt, and a way to resolve the difference is sought after. This is because the authors were in a much better position to know whether the events were true than we are. But that is not how the Bible is treated. Matthew continues to say in verse 51, "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." Wait a minute, didn't you just get done saying that according to Luke, the temple curtain was torn before Jesus died? And here Matthew says it happened after. That's a contradiction. Obviously, we should reject the entire Bible. Well, even if this was a contradiction, that would not be grounds for rejecting the accounts. We would say what we say when we listen to multiple testimonies of any event, that there are some minor differences, but that overall the accounts are true, since they agree on the main points. But there is no contradiction here. Note that Matthew, at the beginning of verse 50 and 51, starts them with the word "and," not "then" or "afterwards" or "immediately," but "and." It means that Matthew is simply spilling all the details and that they are not necessarily in chronological order. So I think verse 51 would actually go before verse 50, chronologically speaking, since Luke states more explicitly that the curtain was torn before Jesus died. However, Matthew does add a couple of details that Luke doesn't, which we can reasonably place with Luke's account of the temple being torn in two just before Jesus' death. These are that it was torn in two from top to bottom, and that the earth shook and the rocks were split. All this happened just before Jesus' death. This is a remarkable example of how tightly interwoven the gospel accounts are. Remember, the more tightly they are interwoven, the less room there is for error. The gospel writers are walking on a knife's edge with their accounts. One false detail, even if it is minor, would contradict the others. Luke continues this story, and this would be right after Matthew 27:50. He says, "When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, 'Certainly this man was innocent.'" And this is something that only the centurion says, and it is only recorded in Luke. Add to this what Matthew says in verse 54 of his account, which says, "When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, 'Truly this was the Son of God.'" And I will explain why I skipped verses 52 and 53 of Matthew in a bit. But according to Luke, the centurion says, "Certainly this man was innocent." According to Matthew, the centurion and those who were with him said, "Truly this was the Son of God." Again, these do not contradict. And we can supplement Matthew's account with Mark's, which adds that the centurion stood facing Jesus as he was on the cross in chapter 15, verse 39, and that it was the way in which Jesus breathed his last that prompted them to believe, also in 15:39. Matthew records in verse 27, 52 through 53, "The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. And I put 52 and 53 after 54 and not before it, because I am ordering the verses chronologically, and Matthew says these events didn't happen until Jesus' resurrection 3 days later. Now I have heard it said that Matthew added verses 52 and 53 for, quote, historical special effect. In other words, he made it up. Implications and theological concerns aside, what basis from within the text would we have for this? Besides contradicting the text, in which it is obviously Matthew's point to convey historical narrative, this claim is embedded in some of the most rigorously interwoven accounts of ancient history that we have, and that speaks all the more to its truth. So, were the gospel writers honestly mistaken? Did they just forget or accidentally alter some of the events they recorded? Like the ball of yarn or the 4 eyewitness accounts, the remarkable intertestamental consistency that was just explained suggests that they were not. Although I included this in step 2 of our timeline because that is where it is directly applicable, it could stand as an argument of its own, because the differences in the gospel accounts show that they are independent and not derived from a common source. That, in combination with what was just seen, makes it very difficult to posit that there are errors, either intentional or unintentional. For if there were intentional errors, the chance that they would unintentionally err in the same way so as to provide 4 agreeing accounts is very low. The same is true of intentional errors. For if the 4 gospel writers intentionally altered or made up the accounts, each one of them bending the truth around what they wanted, the chance that all 4 of them agree is also very low. Even if they colluded to intentionally falsify the accounts, the chance that they would agree in so intricate a manner is very low, and we would expect the accounts, if they were the product of collusion, to not have the appearance of disagreeing. So, this part stands on its own. I only included it in step 2 of the timeline because that is where it is the most applicable. So we have our second step filled out, which is that the original gospel accounts contained the events of Jesus' ministry. That marks the end of part 2. In part 3, I will defend steps 3 and 4, which is that the gospel accounts are independent and that they are not concerningly biased. I hope to see you there.